Bath, and I'm the Executive Director of Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. And, well, we're really excited to be welcoming Greg Myre here among us tonight. I'll introduce him in just a minute, but I want to make sure that you all have at least one of these, if not one of these. So we've got programs and we've got the flyers. Let me just tell you about our next two programs. We're really excited. Brian McLaren, author, activist, speaker in the ecumenical Christian community. Brian really made a name for himself in the emerging church movement. Anyway, Brian will be here on Thursday, March the 20th at 7 o'clock, just a block away at Plymouth Congregational Church. His topic will be Israel-Palestine, the Bible and Peace, how American Christians can become part of the solution. And so it's free and open to the public, and we're really excited that Brian is coming. He's very well known, not only nationally but internationally, in church renewal, but also in the topics of religion and violence, and other really timely topics. And so we're excited that Brian will be coming. Then on Sunday, April the 6th, at the IPFW Reinhardt Recital Hall, our good friend Carrie Newcomer and her husband Robert Midas will be joining us for a benefit concert. Carrie and Robert went with me this past year on the trip that I lead, the Study in Solidarity tour to Israel and Palestine, and we had Carrie singing in refugee camps and in the Silwan neighborhood that's under siege right now, and she sang at the Lutheran World Federation offices on the top of the Mount of Olives. We had maybe 30 or 40 college kids there that evening from all over the world, Germany and Sweden and the U.S. Anyway, she sang at the Quaker Meeting House in Ramallah. So really, we were very excited with the work she did. She's offered to come and do a benefit concert for us Sunday evening, April the 6th. Tickets are $35 a person. $10 for students, and so if that's something you're interested in, please see somebody from the board sitting back at one of the tables in the back tonight. And then in the folder here we have other programs coming up for the rest of the year. You can find them there. The work of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, we educate, enlighten, and engage for peace, justice, and intercultural understanding, both here locally and around the world. And we are passionate. We're passionate in what we do. And I see so many friends here from around town. I also see new faces. And it's really exciting to have you here tonight. Anything else I need to say in terms of nuts and bolts? Potties. One right out the door here. That's a single-seater, I believe. And then if you go out through the little dining room and then up the steps, you'll see men's on the left and women's on the right. And so they accommodate more human beings, those potties that way. Okay, please feel free to grab some sweets and treats at any time during the festivities tonight. Again, thanks for coming tonight. Greg Myre.
You're welcome.
Lessons from the front lines of Israel and Palestine. Greg is a foreign editor for digital news at National Public Radio from 1987 to 2007. For the New York Times and AP, he covered the '91 Gulf War, Pakistan, the Taliban in Afghanistan, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, America's wars in the region, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, inspiring This Burning Land, Lessons from the Front Lines of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, co-authored with his wife, Fox News' Jennifer Griffin. Greg, welcome to a balmy Fort Wayne. It was 70 yesterday until you got here, so whatever you brought from the East Coast, man, take it back with you tomorrow, okay? Welcome to Fort Wayne, Greg, and the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. Take it away.
kind introduction. You really know how to make a guest feel welcome here. And thank all of you for coming out tonight on a very chilly evening to hear a little bit about the Middle East. Is this volume okay? Is everybody able to hear all right with this in the back?
Up a little.
Okay.
Could you raise it up a little bit?
Sure.
Thank you. Let's see.
How is that? Is that a little better? Good in the back?
Better,
Okay.
yes, better.
Okay. So I'm from St. Louis, and this is my first trip to Fort Wayne. But I realized there was a connection here I wasn't aware of just recently before I came here. The New York Times had this little linguistic exercise in the paper, and it said, you know, answer these 25 questions, and we can tell you where you're from. And you know, it's how do you say aunt, or do you say aunt? Do you call it soda or pop or Coke? And you sort of answered it, and it showed you where these phrases or where these words or where these accents came from around the country. And you got to the end of it, it's sort of these professors had come up with this and thought that they could tell you where you lived. And so I finished it up, and it just pops up on the screen. You are either from St. Louis, Missouri, which I am, or Fort Wayne, Indiana. How amazing is that? I was just about to come here. So that made me very confident that you will at least be able to understand my accent tonight. No problem with that. Want to just mention very briefly how I got from the Midwest to the Mideast. And when you say it like that, it sounds like so close, just in the neighborhood. I started working with the Associated Press out of college and decided quite quickly I wanted to become a foreign correspondent, and I got sent to South Africa in 1987 and really felt like I'd won the lottery. There was this amazing story that was taking place there. Got to watch Nelson Mandela walk out of prison. A few months before that, my wife, who had taken a year off of college and come down there, I met her there, and so we covered these events together, and she came back when she graduated. We covered wars, the fighting in South Africa, we covered wars in Mozambique, in Angola, in Namibia, we covered the famine in Somalia, covered the first Gulf War, and we realized these were amazing, dramatic human stories, and we wanted to continue doing this, and was later assigned to Pakistan, and spent a lot of time in Pakistan and Afghanistan in the mid-90s, when there was a war going on in Afghanistan and nobody cared about it at that point. We went later to Cyprus and covered the Arab world, traveled all around, and spent a lot of time in Iraq and Iran, covered Israel and Hezbollah fighting. Then we went to Moscow for 3 years, covered the Chechen War, covered the fighting in the Balkans. And so in 1999, we had the opportunity to go to Jerusalem. And we got to Jerusalem in the fall of 1999. And to describe it now seems almost otherworldly. We've been covering, so for over a decade at that point, we spent a lot of time covering wars and conflict. And we got to Jerusalem at that point, and we felt like somebody was playing this huge practical joke on us. It was like, where's the conflict that we've heard about our entire lives? At that point in time, the peace talks were going on. There was a spirit of coexistence going on. And it was really hard to find it. As we sort of tried to explore the place and drive around, we often didn't know if we were in Israel or the West Bank. The green line that separated Israel and the West Bank was almost purely notional. It was even hard to find on maps, but you could drive. There were no checkpoints. There was nothing stopping you going across the line. Every single morning, 150,000 Palestinians in the West Bank in Gaza would commute into Israel for work, and then they would go home in the evenings. It was no big deal. They were just commuters like you'd find anywhere else in the world. Israeli police and Palestinian police would patrol together in the same squad cars most of the time. Israelis on the weekend, especially on Saturday, on the Jewish Sabbath, when everything was closed in Israel, Israelis would go to the West Bank to do some shopping, get their car fixed, maybe go to the dentist even. There was a large casino built in Jericho, which is deep inside the West Bank, near the border with Jordan. Palestinians, being Muslims, didn't gamble and didn't go there, but a lot of Palestinians, Christians worked there, and the Israelis would go and gamble. And 7 nights a week. Until midnight, Israelis would be out at the casino in Jericho gambling and drive home back into Israel, which would be a 30, 45-minute drive along a sort of very long, isolated road. Felt perfectly safe. There were no bad incidents. So it almost felt like the world was being misled, that there already was some sort of peace or cooperation or coexistence that was taking place. And the politicians, it seemed, just needed to catch up with reality. That these two peoples were living and interacting together. And if you lived in Jerusalem, as my wife and I did, the city was about 2/3 Jewish and about 1/3 Arab at that point. You couldn't help but interact. If you went to a restaurant, if you went to the grocery store, went to the gas station, there were going to be Palestinians working there, there were going to be Israelis working there. And it was really quite striking, the level of interaction between these two peoples at the time. And so we figured, gosh, we're going to have to find something to keep us busy here. Every place else, there's been a war going on or a conflict. And here it's just going to sort of be a Mediterranean vacation for a few years. We literally decided, well, we might as well have kids now because we're not having to race off and run around and go places all the time. And so Jennifer became pregnant, and I was off doing an assignment in Pakistan. And she was saying, well, I called her. I was just about to come back to Jerusalem, and she said, yeah, Ariel Sharon is going to take a walk to the Temple Mount tomorrow. I'm not feeling good, but I got to go cover it because they're saying it could be a big event, and I'm feeling having morning sickness at this point. And I was flying back as this was happening, and sure, he went there. There was the actual event was pushing and shoving, not a lot, but the next day, the Second Intifada erupted, and this was September 29th of 2000. And overnight, things changed instantly. All of this cooperation and coexistence turned into violence. The peace talks, which had seemed close to a success that summer of 2000 at Camp David, where the Israelis and Palestinians had met for 2 weeks. The talks actually did carry on for a bit longer, but everything just changed overnight. And I think it's important to remember what the place was like at that time. It's because this is one of maybe the longest running conflicts in the world. And it's very easy to think, well, it's always been such, and it never changes, and it goes on and on and on. But it does go through these phases and these changes, and that was a particularly opportune moment that was lost. And you see, here we are 14 years later, and we haven't been able to get back to that spot. So the last 14 years have been lost, essentially, in terms of trying to return to that spot. And I think it's very important to understand this because it's very easy to think that this is just a conflict that will never end. It can get better, it can get worse, it won't stay the same. And I think looking at it from afar, it's very easy to become very cynical about it and say, oh, it's never going to get better, it's never going to be resolved. The Israelis, I think, over the last 14 years have moved on in a sense. They've, after the violence ended, they've been able to their economy recovered. You could be an Israeli and have lived a pretty good life the last 14 years, and the conflict probably feels pretty far away from you at this point. The Palestinians, it's been a real disaster. The past 14 years have really been a lost period in terms of their economy, in terms of their dreams of statehood, in terms of just being able to go about everyday, ordinary life. It's a very difficult thing to convey, and we try very hard just to give a sense of what it's like to constantly be going through checkpoints, of trying to get from here to your house and coming across 3 checkpoints that might delay you for hours, or getting up in the morning and not know if you'll be able to get to work because this checkpoint will be closed and they're not letting anybody through. And so this sense of how much life has been limited and circumscribed for the Palestinians over this period, I think is something very difficult to convey, but it's been a very painful experience for the last 14 years, especially when their hopes had been raised fairly high. And I think the greatest casualty, again, has been this loss of just the day-to-day contact that the two sides had. I mean, when I got there initially, you would have these conversations all the time with Israelis. They would say, well, I hate Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians, but, you know, I work with these guys at my office every day, and they're great guys. And, you know, if the Palestinians had decent leadership, well, then, you know, we'd all get along. And the same thing with Palestinians. They would say, you know, well, you know, I hate the Israeli policies, but, you know, I studied in Israel, I went to a university here, I had a job here, and so I know good, decent Israelis. That sort of contact has been almost completely lost. Now, if you're a young person in Israel or Palestine, if you're a young Israeli, you probably served in the military, and your experience is not going to the West Bank to go to a Palestinian restaurant or to shop a little bit. You probably went out there in a uniform with a gun to man a checkpoint or to carry out an operation or do something like that. If you're a young Palestinian, you probably haven't had the chance to even go into Israel. Palestinians who live in places like Bethlehem or Ramallah, which are just, it's really, I know many of you have been there, but it's really one metropolitan area. You have Jerusalem and Ramallah just to the north and Bethlehem just to the south with the green line wrapping around Jerusalem. But in the better days, it was one community. You could live in Ramallah and work in Jerusalem or Bethlehem or vice versa. People move freely from one place to another. Now there are Palestinians in Bethlehem who have never been to, or young people who've never been to Jerusalem or haven't been there in a decade, even though it's literally walking distance. So the way that this contact and the movement has been so limited has had a really profound effect. It just has barred the sort of day-to-day contact that I think makes people feel more comfortable with one another, allows them to interact, and I think is very fundamental to making both sides feel confident that they could do a deal and have a peace treaty and feel confident that yes, if we do it, it doesn't put us at risk or the other side's not going to take advantage of us. And I don't know how you rebuild that. I think it gets built up over years, and then when it's lost over a period of time like this, I think it's very hard to get it back. And I think that is not necessarily something you hear about every day, but it is one of the great tragedies, I think, of the last period, the last 15 years or so. Is Jennifer and I started to explore the place more and more. One of the things that struck us quite early on was just the very, very strange psychology of their place, or what it does to live somewhere in constant conflict. You could date the start of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you could use several dates, but you could certainly start at 1948. You could probably go back further, but for the purposes of this, let's just start with 1948, when Israel declared independence and the first big Israeli-Arab war took place. So that was 66 years ago. So everybody there who's 66 or younger has lived their entire life with this conflict. Imagine if we were still fighting World War II. We're still talking about fighting the Nazis or fighting Imperial Japan. Obviously that the Israelis and Palestinians hasn't been a daily full-fledged war. The conflict runs hot, wanes at times. But nonetheless, that sense of conflict is there. Neither side, the Israelis have never had full peace throughout this time. The Palestinians have never had a state, never had a passport to call their own, to do the normal kinds of things you do in a state, to not have literally a security force from another country control your movements and limit where you can and can't go. So this is a quite extraordinary thing. And it had real psychological impacts. Everybody you knew on both sides of the conflict had these amazing stories. Israelis, for example, you would have grandparents who fought in the War of 48, and their kids who fought in the War of 67, and then their kids who are now fighting in the West Bank. So these generations, and you think in the U.S., well, maybe it was a grandfather who fought in World War II, and somebody who fought in Vietnam, and somebody who's fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan in the past few years. They were all fighting the same war that had never ended. They probably suffered casualties along the way. On the Palestinian side, you had something very similar. So many families lost their homes in 48 and have never been able to go back to those homes. Most of the people in Gaza are classified as refugees. It'd be this very strange thing of somebody, you'd meet somebody who was 60 years old, and they'd say, I'm a refugee, and yet they were living in the house they were born in because of this sense of loss that has never been resolved. Population of 4 million with all of the casualties, all the people who served time in Israeli prisons. Every family has had these tremendous disruptions. And so, what does this do psychologically to live your entire life in a state of political conflict? And it had some, very, in some ways, it had some positive effects. It makes you a survivor. You have to learn to cope. And we were constantly impressed and amazed at the way both sides could deal with loss, could deal with tremendous problems, and cope. It made both societies very incredible with their coping skills. And I think in the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've had literally hundreds of thousands. I think the last figure I saw was something like 400,000 American soldiers who are military personnel who've been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress from the fighting in the wars over the past decade, about 13 years now in Afghanistan. Nobody there ever talked about post-traumatic stress. I mean, it's you mean our life? I mean, it wasn't something that happens to somebody when they go off to a war and they come back with post-traumatic. It's something you grow up with there. I mentioned this to some people today at lunch. At one point, the Israelis were doing something that seemed really pretty much just harassment as far as I could tell, but they would fly F-16 fighter planes over Gaza and have them break the sound barrier, setting off a sonic boom, which is quite an extraordinary thing. We heard lots of bombs fall there. We probably heard a dozen suicide bombings go off from our house or our office. We were in the West Bank and Gaza a lot when the Israelis were bombing, but nothing was quite as shocking as these sonic booms. And I would report a lot from Gaza, and I would be down in Gaza, and I'd be sleeping in a hotel in Gaza City. 3 o'clock in the morning, a plane would fly over. You wouldn't hear the plane, you would just hear this sonic boom. And it would literally rattle your hotel building. It felt like there was a car bomb had gone off in the building. The building was about to come down. And you would wake up and wonder where you were and what had happened. And then usually about 15 minutes later, they would send a second plane over, so you'd just be dozing off back to sleep again. And it would rattle you again. And I thought, wow, this is one of the more, as much fighting as we had seen and as much, many conflicts as we covered, this was still one of the more sort of shocking or things that rattled me more than anything else I'd been through. And so I talked to a Palestinian psychologist about this. He said, what is this? This must be causing problems. People can't sleep through the night. And he sort of shrugged that one off. He said, no, they just learn to adjust. They adapt. And it was like, wait a minute, I've covered a dozen wars in a dozen countries, and this is really, it's unsettling. I said, no, they just adjust. And you would see this again and again with both societies. So there were these great skills at coping, but it also, it brings you to the notion that somehow this is normal life, that planes going off with sonic booms is normal. Troops charging into your neighborhood in the middle of the night is somehow normal. Young men being arrested by the dozens is normal, when obviously these are not normal things. And the Palestinian psychology, I think, evolved over time. Early on, I think during the first Intifada, Palestinians resisted, and they resisted with rocks mostly, and a lot of it involved tear gas and Israeli tear gas and Palestinian rocks. And people said, I want to resist the Israeli occupation, and many were arrested, and there were certainly casualties, but not nearly of the scale. In the first Intifada, was the years about 1987 to 93. So it was about resistance, but it still seemed, the psychology seemed fairly normal. When the second Intifada began, it was something quite different. All of a sudden, the young kids were talking about becoming martyrs, something that they hadn't really spoken about during the first uprising. And one of the things I think was shocking for everybody, Palestinians, Israelis, anybody who was watching this, was until that time, you sort of thought suicide bombers were people who were recruited and indoctrinated and sort of spent years thinking about this and planning. And what you learned all of a sudden was basically a group like Hamas just had to put out the call at the mosque saying, hey, we want suicide bombers. And all of a sudden they were getting lots of people volunteering. The psychology and the attitudes had changed rather dramatically there. And again, it shows in ways that you can't judge from a distance, but up close, the way that attitudes harden, the way that people become more extreme, and how you get into these situations that are the increased bitterness and the increased frustration that builds up over time. And I think this is one of the other things it's easy to forget, is the longer this goes on, the harder it is to solve. And one of the things that always struck us covering wars in different places around the world, most wars, lots of exceptions, but in sort of a general rule, wars seem to have a lifespan of a maximum of 5 years or so. Generally within that period, if a war breaks out, one side will become dominant and win on the battlefield within that period. And so that will end the war simply by military superiority of one side over the other. If that doesn't happen, usually after 3, 4, 5 years of stalemate, both societies tend to just get exhausted. It's exacting a huge burden on all the people involved, not just the people fighting, but the civilians. The economy suffers. The people who led them into the war may no longer, may have seemed like a charismatic leader who were going to lead them to this great victory, but now 3, 4, 5 years later, things don't look so good. The war hasn't been going so well. It's a stalemate. That's cost the political leaders their credibility. And so generally, for various reasons, after a period of several years, wars tend to burn themselves out. People just don't want to do it anymore. Resources are depleted. People are exhausted. And that will somehow bring a natural end to the war, even if there's not a military victory. But again, with the Israelis and Palestinians, there's something that's fairly unique, and that is this ability of the conflict to endure year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. And I don't have a great explanation for that, other than to say it always seemed the gravitational force there was towards the status quo, not towards a resolution. Again, a lot of places where war breaks out, either you have a winner, or the sides get exhausted and they reach some compromise, and it's sort of settled, and then you get back to some sort of state of normalcy. And here, you even when you had the first intifada in the 80s and 90s, you had the second intifada from 2000 to 2005 or so, and you go back right to where you were. Nothing has been resolved. If anything, the situation has gotten worse. The same problems still exist. And so there's this weird, strange, very hard to explain dynamic that even when there is a conflict, even when there is tremendous violence and hardship and suffering for all involved, you don't end up with a resolution at the end of it. And again, I wish I had the answer to this question, and I probably have a Nobel Prize to go with it, but it just seems to be something that they cannot get past. And again, part of the question of psychology there. And even then, this also drives the narratives on both sides. Both sides have this different narrative. And when we got there, sometimes you would hear the language that they would use, and they were constantly trying to convince you of their narrative, both sides. And simply, when you would have a conversation with one side or the other, you would have to sort of catch yourself about the vocabulary you were using. Because it would, as a journalist, you were trying to not try to take sides, not try to be an advocate for one side or the other, but you also didn't want to be seen as being biased for one group or the other. But if you use certain words, that you would be seen as pro one side and anti the other side. And this often puts you in a very awkward position. So you're talking about somebody was a terrorist, or a martyr, or a militant, or a freedom fighter. And you had to say, well, who am I talking with? I'm trying to say this in a neutral way, but whichever word I choose is going to make me seen as being pro one side and anti the other side. And we constantly see these euphemisms that when the fighting got really bad, it would be quite extraordinary. the Israelis would be going in Gaza a lot when the Palestinians were firing rockets from some of the olive groves there. The Israelis would go in through bulldozers, and they would knock down the olive trees, so the ground would be flat and there would be no way to hide and fire the rockets. And they would issue these very anodyne statements talking about doing engineering work in Gaza. I said, well, what do you mean by engineering work? And you would go down there, and these entire olive groves had been removed, and you see these statements, and nobody would be talking about olive trees or knocking them down. The Israelis at one point would take people in the West Bank who were thought to be involved in militancy, and they would forcibly move them to Gaza, and they would talk about this order limiting the place of residency. And we said, well, what are you talking about? What do you mean with this? The Palestinians said, we're talking about forced deportations. And there's this constant battle of language and controlling the narrative that's going on there. And so even when they're not actively fighting, there's this very active public relations campaign that both sides are fighting, and you've often felt caught in the middle of. The other thing that was quite amazing to us was the way that everybody would have to make their own calculations about what was safe and wasn't, what was and what wasn't safe. We would go down to Gaza sometimes when the fighting was pretty heavy, and we were pretty well prepared, and wearing flak jackets and traveling in armored vehicles. And we would come back to Jerusalem, and maybe some Israelis would say, hey, well, I know you were in Gaza. What were you doing there? I mean, do you have a death wish? And we'd say, no, we felt pretty well prepared. And they would say, well, why don't you come have coffee? I want to hear about this on Friday over at our little cafe. And we'd say, are you crazy? We're not going to go sit in that cafe. That's a place that's likely to be attacked. And so for us, that was a safety calculation. This was the nearest road coming in from the West Bank, and therefore it was likely to be a very dangerous spot. Palestinians would say, oh, well, let's go out tonight. And I say, are you crazy? We're not going to be driving around in the West Bank at night. The Israelis have a curfew on. You could be innocently driving, but they're going to mistake you for somebody that's trying to attack them, and you could get shot in your car before you have a chance to explain yourself. And so everybody had their own little safety calculations. I actually discovered something, a talent I never knew we had, which was how to talk to tanks. When the Israelis in 2002 re-invaded the West Bank, they had withdrawn during the 90s from a lot of Palestinian cities, not entirely from the West Bank, but from the main cities. They went back in large numbers in 2002. And the Israelis had declared a curfew, but as journalists we had some right to be there. But what you would often find is you'd be traveling down some very narrow streets in the West Bank, and you might turn a corner and you'd be staring right at an Israeli tank with the barrel pointed at you. And so this puts you in an awkward situation. Did you reverse very quickly, which might excite the person in the tank and get the reaction you're not looking for? Did you proceed? What do you do? If you get out, they're going to see that as suspicious and think maybe this is a car bomb. So what do you do? And so we quite quickly developed a system where you would put your hands on the windshield just to show that, trying to emphasize that you were not there for any malign reasons. And then often you would get this response from the tank. The tank would sometimes just do this. The tank gun would just go, which meant no, go back. Just like a parent wagging a finger at a child. Sometimes, though, the tank gunner would actually turn the gun to the side, which meant you're welcome to pass. And so you develop this sort of ability to communicate with tanks and just hope that there was never any miscommunication, that you were all speaking the same language. So we had two little girls who were born there, and looking back on it from this vantage point, it seems crazy, but it felt a lot, I think, like the frog in the boiling pot. And we had been covering conflicts in a lot of different places. We started covering the conflict here. Our first daughter was born in 2001, and the second one in 2002, when the conflict was really bad. And mostly we just didn't sleep because of the time difference. We would finish up our work and dealing with our editors until midnight, and our kids are never very good sleepers, and they would wake us up in the middle of the night constantly. We'd get up at 6 o'clock and start all over again. But people would always ask us, well, why don't you leave? And, you know, another oddity of the conflict there was life would feel normal, and you'd wake up every day, and everybody would go off to work, Israelis and Palestinians, generally, go off to work, go to school. The day seems normal, feels like you're in a relatively normal place, right up into the nanosecond when jets would come screaming out of the sky to drop bombs, or a suicide bomb attack would happen. And unlike all of the other conflicts where you'd go in and you'd be geared up and you were completely in the mind frame of being in a conflict zone, here you would often, it was a very odd feeling. And then after a while, after you got used to it, especially around 2002 and 2003 when the fighting was really, really bad, it was this horrible feeling. You'd wake up and it'd be this beautiful, sunny, calm Middle Eastern day, and you would just think, I know something bad is going to happen at some point in the day. And sure enough, it would. And so this sense of normalcy being up against this horrible violence and this horrible chaos was just this constant crazy idea. And you would see, if you were walking around the Israelis at that time, well, certainly in the Palestinian areas, but even inside Israel, the security was just sort of insane. And one of my favorite amusing things to watch was going into a bank. Because like every place, they would have a security guard outside of it. And a lot of Israelis, people in the army or people, West Bank settlers who come into Jerusalem to do business, would often be carrying a weapon with them, and often an automatic rifle. And so they would come up to the bank, getting ready to go walk into the bank with an automatic rifle over their shoulders, which is, you know, not something you see every day. And the guard would say to them, in this very surreal conversation, which you didn't understand unless you'd been there for a while, they would say, do you have a weapon? And there's this M16 slung over their shoulder. It's like, what is this? What's going on here? But that wasn't, the question was really, do you have a bomb under your jacket? This was really the question they were asking. And so the person would say, no, I don't have a weapon, even though the rifle is right there. And the security guard would sort of wave his electronic wand all over him and see that, okay, there was no weapon. And then he would direct them to the nearest bank teller. And so I suggest trying that tomorrow, walking into a bank with an automatic weapon and where's the teller? But this was life in that place. And you would have to shake yourself sometimes and say, well, this is normal. This is everyday life here. And this is, I think, what fascinated us throughout our time there. And again, it's what ultimately made us decide to write the book. I mean, there was a library full of books on the Middle East and the Israelis and Palestinians and the policy issues and the history and all of that. And we didn't want to add to that. We didn't need to write another book like that. But it was just these stories. What is it like? How is it like living in this conflict day after day for your entire life? I want to just tell a few stories about a few Palestinians I knew there, which again sort of captured the crazy nature of this conflict. One was a family called the Karakis, who lived in Hebron in the West Bank. And they lived next to the Tomb of the Patriarchs, again a sort of disputed holy site, claimed by, it's holy to Muslims, to Jews, to Christians. And it's in the center of Hebron, and that's the most important place. In fact, it's really one of the most, for Jews, it's one of the most, it is the second most important holy site after Jerusalem. And it's also a place of constant conflict because there's a very small Israeli settler community, about 500 settlers in the center of Hebron, surrounded by about 150,000 Palestinians. And the Israeli military would guard those 500 settlers there, but it just made for sort of constant friction because they were in the center of this very, very tightly packed city. And so when the Intifada began in 2000, there was immediately a lot of the daily events of rock throwing, shooting, not that many bombs initially, but just constant friction there. And I was there with a Palestinian photographer one day early on, and we were covering sort of rock throwing, tear gas shooting, and we were sort of running to get away from it. We came down the street, and we really screwed up. Because all of a sudden, we walked right into the middle of one of these conflicts. At one end of the street were Israeli soldiers shooting tear gas canisters. And at the other end were Palestinian kids throwing Molotov cocktails. And maybe 50 yards apart. And it was a very, very narrow street. No sidewalks. The houses were right up against the sides of the street. And the photographer couldn't have been happier. You know, he goes this way, and he's got the kids throwing Molotov cocktails. He goes this way, and he's getting the muzzle flash of the Israelis shooting tear gas. It's great. He's really happy. I'm much less happy at this point. I'm sort of looking for an escape route, and there is none. And these things are just, you can just hear them literally whizzing past in both directions. And so I turn around to the nearest house, start banging on the door. There's no window, but there's like a little latch, and a guy, turns out one of the Karakis, opens the window. And I say, could we come in, please? And he let us in, and this house is just filled with people. And so, very typically, they're very hospitable. They sit us down for tea. We start talking. Meanwhile, there's this riot going on right out in front of their house, but they don't really seem perturbed by it because this happens basically every day in Hebron at this time. And as I talk to them, I discover there's actually two houses. There's one, and there's a little asphalt space, and there's a second one, two big stone, 3-story houses. 6 brothers grew up in these houses. They married 6 women. The women moved in, and they started having kids. So there are now more than 70 people living in these 2 houses. 50 of them are kids. And at this point, Israel had had a curfew on for about a month. And a full-on curfew, and what it meant was you could not leave your house. And about every 3rd day or so, the Israeli military would drive down the street with a megaphone and say, okay, we're lifting the curfew for 3 hours so you can go shopping. And then the market would reopen, and everybody would rush out, they would shop for 3 hours, they'd rush back home, and then the curfew was back on again for 3 days. So at this point, these 50 kids had basically been inside the house for a month. And I was sort of just blown away by this story. And the brothers, the 6 brothers, they all worked in the construction business, so they drove. So they were even in worse shape than most people, because even, some shops could open for a day, or you could go back to work for a few days here and there. These guys couldn't go anywhere. It was just impossible to drive a truck around anywhere in the West Bank or Gaza. So every time I went back to Hebron, I would check in with the Karakis, if only to take a census count. And so this was 2000, and I got back around 2000, I can't remember, 2003, 2004. I show up again. Again, the curfew, at this point, Hebron has changed dramatically. The Palestinians in the center of the city have almost all moved out. It's a ghost town. The curfew was on for such extended periods that people just couldn't really continue their lives. The shops couldn't open, the schools couldn't open, you couldn't move around. So a lot of families had just picked up and moved and left, and maybe we're going to come back at some point in the future, maybe not. But now the Karakis have more than 90 people in their house. And so it's pretty hard to find housing for a family of 90. And they said, yeah, it's pretty miserable. We are all political experts because we just watch Al Jazeera all day, and we make babies. And they literally had barely been out of their house for 3 or 4 years at this point. And I went back in 2007, I went many times, but in 2007, before I left, I went back and saw them again. And there were now more than 100 Karakis living there. And the area was completely deserted. I think they were really the only family that was still in a several block area at this point. And yet somehow life had gotten even worse, because at one end, if you came out of their house and you went to the right, which had been the center of their life, that was toward the center of the city. Now about 50 yards down the road was a permanent 24-hour Israeli checkpoint that looked like it had an airport metal detector with a little gate that you walk through and a little conveyor belt. And so literally if they walked out of their house and went towards where the markets and the schools and everything used to be, this is what they saw. They had to go through this, it was like going through airport security every time you left your house. They could go the other way, but that was not really where their life was. was oriented. It was often very hard to convey this because by 2007 the Intifada was basically over. Things were returning somewhat to normal at this point. And yet here was this family living in a deserted neighborhood with 100 people, 70 or so of them kids. And yet their lives had been, transformed beyond recognition. And so this is what this is an extreme case, but it's really what Palestinian life has become over the past 15 years or so. I want to mention one other family in talking about some West Bank examples, but in Gaza, I met a guy named Ibrahim Abu Shatat, and he, trying to think where I first met him because I ran into him several times, but in Gaza, they have an extraordinary rush hour, they used to, and it took place at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it was really one of the more remarkable things I'd ever seen. Before relations fully broke down, before the Intifada, and even for the first few years, tens of thousands of Palestinian men would commute from Gaza into Israel every day and work. And it was actually a long trip because when you leave southern Israel, there's not a whole lot of big cities, so you really have to get up to Tel Aviv or to Jerusalem, which is quite a long trip. So I knew about this, and I heard it, so I go down there one night, and it's 5 minutes till 3, and it's dead quiet. And Israelis have their security checkpoint, and there's just long tunnels where people would come through, but nobody was there. Very quiet. All of a sudden, at 3 o'clock, all of these yellow Mercedes taxis that the Palestinians use would come up and disgorge 6, 7, 8 guys out of the taxi. They still have these scruffy clothes on from their work the day before. They'd be eating some bread, eating a piece of fruit, get them through the morning. And they were often on these 3 or 4 hour commutes to their job. And it was backbreaking. They would go to work, they would leave at 3 in the morning, get to work at 7 or 8 in the morning, work all day, come back. It was a shorter commute coming back because Israelis didn't care what was going into Gaza, they just cared what was coming out. But they would get home at 7 or 8 at night and go to sleep and get up at 3 o'clock in the morning again and do this all over. And I met Ibrahim Abu Shatat there, and lots of Palestinians in Gaza have misfortune, but his case really struck me as one of the most the sad and tragic ones, in that he had worked hard as a welder in Israel for 20 years, and to keep getting your work permit renewed time and time again, it means you're obviously a good worker, the company still wants to employ you, you haven't been involved in any trouble, the Israelis don't suspect you of having done anything wrong. But he had the misfortune of, he lived at the very southern tip of Gaza, right on the border with Egypt. And when the fighting started, the Palestinians, there'd always been these smuggling tunnels underneath the border between Gaza and Rafah in Egypt. And in fact, the town of Rafah is split between Egyptian Rafah and Gaza Rafah, and there's these smuggling tunnels underneath. And in normal times, it might be cigarettes or some product you can sell, but when the Intifada began, it became weapons. So the Israelis really wanted to cut these off. And they started tearing down the first row of houses next to the border fence. And then they tore down the second row. And then they tore down the third row. And Abu Shatat and his family had a house that he had built from his many years of labor in Israel. And his house got torn down. So he rented another house. And then that house got torn down. And so when I met him, actually, he was living with his wife and his 8 kids in the storage room under the soccer stadium in southern Gaza. And he'd been there for a couple of years. And this seemed to just encapsulate how everybody in the conflict, and particularly on the Palestinian side, gets drawn in and has their life affected by it, even if you just want to keep your nose clean, go about your business, do your job. He'd lost his job because Israel stopped allowing Palestinian workers in, and he lost 2 houses at this point, and he was living in a storage shed under a soccer stadium. And about this time, in 2005, the Israelis were pulling the settlers out of Gaza. And they pulled out the 8,000 or so Jewish settlers that lived in Gaza. There were none left. And one of the, perhaps, one of the consequences of this is there were going to be about 1,600 homes that the settlers were leaving behind. And very Israeli homes, little small cookie-cutter homes with a little plot of land, red tile roofs. And you thought, well, one of these cosmic coincidences, the Israelis had torn down about 1,600 homes in that part of Gaza, and now they were leaving behind about 1,600 homes. Well, okay, that'll be a nice fit for people who lost their home. And yet in this sort of perverse, irrational thinking that sort of pervades the conflict, and really from both sides at times, the Israelis and Palestinians both agreed it would be best to tear down these perfectly good houses. The Israelis thought it would be good to tear them down because the settlers didn't like the thoughts of Palestinians moving into their houses. So that wasn't a particularly good reason, but that was their thinking. The Palestinian leadership thought, well, it's a lot of land, and these houses are sort of have a plot of land around them. They take up too much space. We actually need to build more condensed housing. We may want to use this for an industrial zone, for different things. And also, if we gave them out, people are desperate for housing in Gaza. There'll be 1,600 families that are winners, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands that are losers. And so we think they should be torn down too. And so these houses are torn down. And Abu Shatat, who lived there, is living under the soccer stadium for 3 years, watching 1,600 perfectly good homes get wiped out. And it just struck me, as it struck anybody, how the logic, the conflict takes on its own logic, its own absurdities, that just literally make no sense. And of course, I don't know what the exact status is, but I think there's been very, very little building going on because the Israelis have imposed very tight restrictions on what comes into Gaza, and getting building materials in there has been one of the big problems over the years. So where does this leave us today? I want to finish up here in just a few more minutes and then let you guys ask questions. And it doesn't have to be about just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We can certainly talk about the broader region. But we're at a moment when there's another attempt being made at Middle East peace. And one of the historical coincidences that struck me, probably not a coincidence, but if you date this conflict, the major efforts to resolve the conflict have come following huge, monumental, earth-shaking, worldwide events. The first time was at the end of World War I. The British were given a mandate to run Palestine, which they kept for 25 years, and then gave it up. And then at the end of World War II, as the British left, the United Nations came into being. One of the first things they tried to do was create a two-state solution for the Israelis and Palestinians. That didn't work. There was a war in '48. The next big attempt came at the end of the Cold War, when you began the Madrid talks and the Oslo process of '93. So in the 20th century, we saw three big attempts: end of World War I, end of World War II, end of the Cold War. And it sort of raises the question, again, with this conflict that keeps gravitating towards the status quo, do you need some big earth-shattering event to even create the opportunity to address it? And John Kerry doesn't think so. He thinks that by the strength of his personality, he can go in there and perhaps bring about a solution. Now, I've talked to a lot of people in Washington, and John Kerry is very, very sincere, and he's pushing very, very hard to try to make this happen. So far, he hasn't had a lot of success, and we'll see. He's bumping up now against some of his own self-made deadlines. But next Monday, Benjamin Netanyahu, will be meeting with President Obama at the White House. It looks like Mahmoud Abbas will be meeting with Obama probably sometime in March as well. And the significance here is that Obama, after he made an attempt in 2010, or early in his administration, to address the conflict, and then he's basically set it aside. He's had too many other issues that he's felt were more important. You've still got the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think you've still got the Syrian war, obviously. I think his big bet is on Iran, and I think that's where he's still, where he's focus predominantly right now. I don't think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is necessarily on the front burner, but John Kerry has more or less put it there. So Obama seems to be re-engaging now, which seems to mean that he thinks it's serious, he wants to make a big effort. Don't see a lot of necessarily reason for optimism, but they are making a big push, so it'll be very interesting to see what happens. Maybe the Arab Spring has certainly not turned out the way many hoped it would in terms of creating democracies and a more peaceful, prosperous Middle East, but it is creating all sorts of realignments and shaking up the region and may create some opportunities. So we will see. The Israelis, I think, can bide their time. I think for the Palestinians, the Israelis can go about relatively normal lives, and the Palestinians can't. So I think there is a greater sense of urgency on the Palestinian side. And in our book, we came up really with 10 reasons why this conflict is getting harder to solve, not easier. The longer it goes on, I think it becomes more and more difficult. For the sake of brevity, I'll just point out 5 quick ones. The societies have become so divided now. You just look at the Palestinians, it's obvious with the Fatah leadership in the West Bank and Hamas leadership in Gaza. It's going to be very difficult for the Palestinians to work out an agreement with the Israelis if they remain divided. Israeli society, I think, also has become very divided. In the 90s, there was an attitude of let's give this a shot, let's give this a chance. The Israelis, I think, are very cynical now. They, in their minds, they feel like we withdrew from Lebanon and we got rockets from Hezbollah, we withdrew from Gaza and we got rockets from Hamas. We're not going to withdraw from the West Bank and get more rockets in exchange. So that's not the rest of the world, much of the world doesn't see it that way, but that's how the Israelis tend to see it. Jerusalem continues to get more and more complicated. As more Israelis move into East Jerusalem, which Palestinians want for a future capital. Jerusalem really is part of a sort of zero-sum game. If one side gets part of Jerusalem and the other side doesn't, it's very hard to find ways to sort out Jerusalem. The settlements. In 1993, when the peace talks began, there were about 100,000 West Bank settlers, Israeli West Bank settlers. There's 350,000 now. So just in terms of logistics, how would all of these people be removed, how many could stay, the amount of land they're taking up now is expanding. So it's just a much, much larger problem in terms of numbers. The economies have separated. In the 90s, again, there was all this economic cooperation and integration, and Palestinians can't come to Israel and work in large numbers. Their economies are very, very separate. The Israeli one doing pretty well, the Palestinian one doing very poorly. And the Israelis also learned that they didn't necessarily need that Palestinian labor, which I think in the 90s they might have thought that they did. They brought in workers from Thailand and Romania and lots of places, and felt that they no longer need the Palestinian labor. So I think that was a big loss. And the situation in the broader region is such a mess now. From the Israeli point of view, they look to their north and they see Hezbollah getting stronger in Lebanon. They see the Syrian civil war. They see the chaos that's been playing out in Egypt. They worry about the Iranian nuclear program. They don't feel it is a time for them to make any big leaps of faith and to do any big deals. So I think that mitigates against a solution now. So all of these reasons, I think, are reasons to be pretty pessimistic, which is a pretty safe position to take in the Middle East. But the thing that my wife and I, after 7 years there, seeing all of this violence and all this trouble that still gave us hope, was really just the people that we met and came across and their resilience. And one of the most remarkable people I met, and I'll finish with his story, is Dr. Izzeldin Abu Eleish. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was a pretty remarkable guy, still is. In Gaza, he became a very gregarious, outgoing guy. After the '67 war, he was a young kid. He wanted to meet Israelis. He started working in Israel. He became a doctor, became an obstetrician, became the first Palestinian to become a staff doctor at an Israeli hospital. He would go to Beersheba, where he'd be an obstetrician working with Israeli couples, and IVF is very big in Israel, and he would be consulting with these families and helping to make these very personal and intimate decisions. And then he would go back on the weekends to the Jabalia refugee camp, where he had 8 kids. And so he lived this sort of very odd dual existence of being a high-tech doctor on the weekdays and living in the Jabalia refugee camp on the weekends. And I met him while he was doing this back in 2001. But as the conflict got worse and worse, it became impossible to go back and forth between Gaza and Israel. So he took a year, went to Harvard, got a master's degree, went back. It was still a terrible situation. He went off to Afghanistan to work for the World Health Organization for a year or two, and he went back again. And he was starting this one-man peace process. He used to host Israeli families back in the 90s when they would come down and visit, and people were still in this mood of coexistence. Things got worse and worse. He felt very trapped there. He was able eventually to find a bit of a different job, but also working in an Israeli hospital in Tel Aviv. And then in 2008, 2009, December of 2008, or January of 2009, the Israelis launched this big operation, Operation Cast Lead. And a lot of it was taking place in the Jabalia refugee camp. And been a lot of shootings around his neighborhood, and he had connections in Israel, and he would even talk to the military and say, "Hey, I don't know why you're shooting in this area. Why do you have these tanks there?" And the Israelis were actually listening. And this fighting lasted for about 3 weeks. On the last day of the fighting, Dr. Abu Eleish hadn't been able to get out of Gaza, so he was actually on Israeli radio and television. The Israeli radio and TV stations would call him because they couldn't send their own reporters down there, and he spoke fluent Hebrew, so he would tell them what he was seeing in the Jabalia refugee camp. And he was literally on the phone to an Israeli television anchor, waiting to talk to him, telling him about the fighting. When the Israelis thought they saw a spotter on the top of his roof, and they fired a tank shell into his house. And they killed 3 of his 8 kids, and they also killed one of his nieces. And he started screaming about what was happening live on Israeli television. And he had to get, some of his other kids were badly injured, and he had to get them out. A horrific story by any standards, but it didn't stop him from doing what he'd been doing, which was talking to Israelis and trying to bring about peace. And it was what he's continued to do since then is preach that same message. And what he wrote, or what he told me, a few months after this incident, he was in Washington, and I went to see him. And he spoke with me, and it's the way I finished the book, because it was the one thing that gave us hope. And so this was the spring of 2009, when just a few months after he lost his kids. And he said he had decided to leave Gaza for a while. He accepted a position at the University of Toronto, taking his surviving kids with him. He would not be working with the Palestinians or Israelis, but he was still intent on spreading his message. Quote, "Arguing who has suffered the most does not get us anywhere," he said. "The cycle is so hard to break. The fighting causes suffering, the suffering creates victims, the victims are filled with righteousness and grievances. Yet Dr. Abu Eleish refused to be a link in this chain. He said, quote, "I am not a victim. I don't want to be a victim. I work on the things I can change. It's a waste of time to think about the things you can't change. I lost 3 precious daughters. I can only do good things for their memory. I have 5 more precious children. They are the future." He's now a doctor at the University of Toronto, but he continues to speak out. And it's people like him, I think, that are the one reason to be hopeful. I will end on that note, and I'm happy to address any questions you guys might have.
thank you very much. It was very interesting, and because of the details of the stories you tell about a lot of sane, non-terror type people, it gives you optimism for what might happen. This is the fourth one of these talks I've heard since the first of the year, and they all have a commonality about them. They talk about the history, they talk about the problems, but no one seems to say, look, if we can just figure out someone, use John Kerry's term, figure out a framework, just to get from here, maybe not to there, but get from here to here. These are the benefits you get. The benefits have to be enormous for the Palestinians and the Israelis and the local area. I mean, think of what it could be 10 or 15 years from now if you could really generate some economic powerhouses in the area. But nobody puts that out there as what we're trying to get to. It's always, oh God, it's just a mess, and how can we possibly solve the problems?
Right. I think we saw
Could you repeat part of the question for the...
Sure. So the question was about how everybody talks about the problems, but do not recognize the potential benefits for the region. And I agree. It was something that was so obvious to me about that. It's always talking about politics and land and the zero-sum game of who gets how much land. But the economic benefits, which were very, very clear, I think, in the late 90s, that's sort of gone off the table. I mean, the Israelis have sort of gone on and figured out ways to keep their economy pretty strong. But the way the Palestinians have suffered so grievously, and I wish the Palestinians at times would concentrate a little more on economic issues, because the Israelis make their life extraordinarily difficult in terms of conducting normal day-to-day business. But I still think it's an area that both sides can look at a little more closely. I think if people are busy working, it gives them a lot less time to talk about politics and other things. So yes, I agree entirely, and it is a region with a lot of educated and very talented people, and it could be the economic center of the region. Yes, sir.
Does there exist any effort to promote bilingualism among Israeli and Palestinian children?
A lot of, it's a classic situation. A lot of Palestinians learn Hebrew in Israeli prisons. In fact, it was Marwan Barghouti, probably the most famous Palestinian prisoner, became fluent in Hebrew. You have, in Israel, you've got more than 1 million Arabs who are Israeli citizens, so they speak Hebrew. A lot of Palestinians in the West Bank do. Many fewer Israelis. When you see an Israeli who speaks fluent Arabic, it probably means they were in military intelligence. They've done a lot of interrogating Palestinian suspects. So you don't see a lot of that. People tend to speak, Israelis speak Hebrew, Palestinians speak Arabic, and then they probably speak English maybe as a second language. You don't see there are some schools in Israel that have tried to integrate Arab and Jewish kids and teaching them bilingually, but it's a very small effort at this stage.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. First I want to say thank you so much to the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace and for you for being here. I teach over at ICMEP an Intro to Peace and Conflict Studies, and brought our small class tonight. We've been talking about a lot of this in the abstract and theoretical, but I think it's great to get the first-hand experiential insight. That said, on my own regard, not representing the class or the university, there are two things that come to mind for me. One thing we actually have been discussing about visible and invisible violence and the aspect of sort of chronic trauma, or people may feel as though things are becoming normal with bombs dropping, but then there's that long-term impact, and it's just something that came to mind as you were talking about the easy recruits for suicide bombers and such. That I'm curious if you see that as maybe an impact of that chronic trauma. But then secondly, on a personal level, one thing that I've often tried to get my head around, curious if you have any insight, is in terms of the external funding influences of our U.S., the lobbying that takes place in the United States, and that dynamic in terms of the ability for us to set a clear framework that's trusted by both sides. I'm trying to balance my personal views here, but I've seen that as being, it appears to be an ongoing challenge to get both sides to the table in terms of a lot of the lobbying that we have even on our home front and then our U.S. funding. So do you have any insight on that?
Sure. I'm happy to address both of those. On the violence, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, again, the difference between the first Intifada in the 80s and 90s and the second one, you saw the kids being much more willing to become martyrs as they, it was sort of shocking in some instances. You would see kids, you would walk around, and particularly in Gaza, and West Bank too, they would put out martyr posters. So if somebody was killed, either because they carried out an attack or if they were killed by an Israeli strike or whatever, a big poster would go up of the kid. And so if you're a poor kid in Gaza, you don't have a Michael Jordan to look up to as an athlete, or you don't have singers or movie stars to look up to. These are the people you would tend to look up to. And we would meet kids, and they would have a picture of themselves in their breast pocket. And maybe somebody had lent them a gun, and they were holding a gun or something. And you see 12, 13-year-old kids with the picture, and they'd say, oh, this is going to be my martyr photo. So if I get killed, please use this photo on my martyr poster. And so this is what you look up to. So yes, I mean, in many, many ways, it affected people's psychology, that being one of the more dramatic. On your second question regarding funding, the U.S. gives Israel about $3 billion a year. That's almost now, I think, entirely military assistance. It used to be sort of half and half, or close to half and half, and the economic assistance was phased out, and now it's entirely military assistance. Most of it goes to buy U.S. hardware. The U.S. also gives several $100 million a year to the Palestinians in aid, supporting the UN Refugee Agency and other basic assistance to the Palestinians. So the U.S. does give a lot of money. Is it going to the right places? Is it doing the right things? I mean, I think that's a really good debate. I'm not going to say, well, it should go here, here, and here. I think it's a very important question to discuss. People have talked about certain ideas, floated ideas. Instead of giving Israel $3 billion a year to buy military hardware, which they're very capable of defending themselves against the Palestinians or any other conventional force in the Middle East. What if you use that money to pay settlers to leave the West Bank? Because for a lot of settlers, they've gone to the West Bank. Some are for religious reasons. Some think they're doing it for security, strengthening the security of Israel. But an awful lot of them are just there for economic reasons. You can get a house with a yard and a low mortgage that's partially subsidized, as opposed to living in a small, cramped apartment in Tel Aviv. And they would like to leave, but I wouldn't say like to. They would be willing to leave if they knew they weren't going to lose all their equity in their home, or if they knew that Israel and the Palestinians agreed to a peace deal and the government said it's time to leave, they'd be willing. So I think there's lots. I wish, without dictating what a policy should be, I wish there was a broader discussion about what was going on and ways you could use the money and how that is done. And in such a like an automatic reaction, and it's okay, $3 billion, $3 billion, do what you want with it.
You said earlier that for the Palestinians, if they concentrate on building their own economy, they will be at peace. But in the same token, to have a good economy, you have to have the freedom to move around. That's very good. How can it be possible if you are confined?
No, I spoke to Myre today. Yes, I mean, maybe I wasn't being clear, but yes, under the conditions that the Palestinians have been in really since about 2000, 2001, they face tremendous obstacles, as you well know. I mean, just moving around, just going, you trying to get from Nablus to Jenin or from Nablus to Ramallah. I mean, there were weeks and months when you just couldn't do it. And then there are times when it might take you all day to go there. If you're a businessman trying to import goods and then export those goods, one of the most amazing things was the industrial area on the border between Israel and Gaza. There were like 40, 50 factories where the Israelis own most of them, but some of them were owned by Palestinians or jointly owned. And they made a lot of clothes and furniture there. And they're walking into a big room, not quite this big, but almost this big. And there were about 100 Palestinian men sewing little black cocktail dresses. Gaza is a very traditional society. Not many women work outside the home, so even a job of sewing and making dresses was a man's job in Gaza. But just to walk into this big room and seeing them make all these little black cocktail dresses was quite a sight. Those kinds of things have all disappeared. You know, there were some joint projects going on, and without assigning blame to anybody, it's just a real shame that that's gone, because I think that was one of the things that could have helped bring about peace.
John and then Todd.
Thank you. The formal position of the U.S. government and the Israeli government, the Palestinians, and all the major players, is for a two-state solution, right? It seems that, to me, the methodical expansion of settlements to the West Bank is evidence that the Israelis are really into a one-state solution. And they're very sensitive to the BDS movement, the expanded BDS movement, which is a direct attack on the settlements. Would you comment on this nexus?
Right. I mean, there's a real contradiction in the Israeli policy, where the Israelis most Israelis say they want a two-state solution. They don't know Israelis, whether liberal or conservative, want a situation where millions of Palestinians become part of Israel. So on the one hand, there's this constant talk about we want to remain a Jewish and democratic state, and Jews account for about 75–80% of the population in Israel. And they don't want a situation where the Jewish percentage of the population falls because of a lot of Palestinian citizens. And yet they build settlements in areas where it forces them, the result is they have to maintain an occupation and not allow Palestinians to have their own state or their political rights. So you're right, there's a real contradiction here. I don't think Israelis don't want a one-state solution, but if you keep building settlements, you do run into this contradiction. I mean, you run into an endless, eternal occupation.
Is the ground beginning to shift in the Israeli political scene? From under them, there seems to be a shift in the center away from the right wing.
No, I don't think so. I would.
Some Israelis wanting to resolve the conflict.
I think in the 90s you saw that. I think in the past 10 years or so you haven't seen that. I think that the country got more conservative. They feel they were being attacked, and therefore they shouldn't be making concessions. They look around at the chaos in the broader neighborhood in Lebanon and Syria and Egypt and say this is not the time to be taking risky moves. I think the Israeli demographics are making the place a little more conservative. You had the Ashkenazi Jews, the European Jews, who traditionally had dominant positions in the government and the military. They're becoming a smaller and smaller portion of the population. Parties like the Liberal Labor Party are shrinking. The Sephardic Jews of Middle East origin, their numbers are getting bigger and bigger, and they tend to be more conservative. You had an influx of 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union. They tend to be very, very conservative. So I think for all of these reasons, I think Israel's become actually more conservative over the past decade or so.
Thank you.
Todd?
It seems to me that in order to negotiate any kind of compromise in any situation, both sides have to have something to offer to the other. And you made the point that economically the U.S. is giving $3 billion to Israel and a few $1 million, or even a few $100 million to the Palestinians. It makes it feel that when then the U.S. tries to go in and negotiate a settlement between those two sides, which we are blatantly tipping one side over the other, that it seems inauthentic at best and cynical at worst to pretend that we're actually working towards trying to achieve a peaceful solution. Is there, in your observation, any sincere authenticity on the part of American diplomacy that has any resolution or any authenticity with the way we actually act and send our dollars?
Yeah, I wouldn't get the aid issue. The amount of money is important. I wouldn't make that, though, the most important issue. And the U.S. government, obviously, there are different opinions on this. And you look at the Congress, which, that's the one thing they can agree on, and one place where you get unanimous vote is when it's an Israeli issue. But if you talk to people at the State Department, there's a very different, attitude. If you look at the Obama administration, the Clinton administration. So, I mean, there are different power sectors driving this. And I wouldn't get too hung up on the money, but more on the issue of, the Israelis hold most of the cards in these negotiations. The Palestinians have very little to offer. I mean, they can threaten to carry out violence or not. They can demand the right of return. They can demand certain things, but they hold very, very few cards in a very weak bargaining position, and that's one of the problems. I think that's why the Israelis sort of want to buy time. They feel that as time goes on, we can expand our settlements, and these things become facts on the ground, as they like to say. And I think I don't think the U.S. can dictate a solution to either side. It can't force the Palestinians to accept a bad deal. They can certainly put some pressure on Israel, but I don't think they can force Israel to do something they don't want to do either. So the U.S. has an important role to play, but the Israelis and Palestinians have to, I think, initiate the process. And that's one of the things that makes me a little skeptical about what's happening now. John Kerry is very enthusiastic, and I give him full marks for all his efforts, but it's still hard to tell whether the Israelis and Palestinians are fully invested in this negotiation, or do they just want to be seen as, it's not my fault that they broke down. They're trying to do enough to say, not my fault, but not really fully engaged.
John?
I'm not sure what your first words were, but it was something like, don't make too much of the money situation. How can you not make a lot of 30 billion versus a few hundred million?
Well, it's $3 billion a year, but the Israeli economy is very, very large. That's 1% or so of the Israeli economy.
That we're contributing in the military.
True. It's $3 billion. It buys a lot of hardware. I'm saying the Israeli economy is not going to collapse. It's going to continue on, and you look at the hardware they're buying, it often tends to be things like high-end stuff, F-16s, helicopters, other hardware. Quite frankly, I'm not sure how much Israel needs it. They haven't fought a conventional state-on-state war. It's for those kinds of wars, which they haven't fought since 1973. Their threats are rockets from Hezbollah, rockets.
It just seems we ought to be able to come up with a more creative use of $3 billion.
Again, I think that's a debate. I agree. I think that's a debate that should be held. But I just don't think that's going to tip the conflict one way or the other. And I just think the Israelis have a very strong. Their military would still be strong. Their economy would still be strong. It would certainly send a message and a signal to the Israelis that U.S. policy has changed. But
you haven't mentioned the word Zionism, and the political Zionism of a Jewish state for Jewish people, and the religious Zionism and the role that those two play. But then also the question I'd have about that is Europe, you're starting to see now, is starting to look at Israel as a rogue state in some ways. And you're starting to see disinvestment of funds and boycotting of Israeli-produced goods and sanctions against Israel from quite a few of the European states. What do you see the role of Zionism as a political entity and as a religious entity, and then how that might, change if Israel becomes viewed as a human rights abuser?
Very good question, and we could devote the whole night to that. But what's very interesting, and I guess I didn't fully appreciate until I got there, is most all Israelis, Jewish Israelis, call themselves Zionists. But they have very different definitions of what that means. It just means can mean a homeland for the Jewish people in this part of the world, or the religious Zionism that says we must all of this land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River is ours. We can't give it back because God gave it to us. So this hugely broad definition of Zionism there. And even Palestinians, one of, I can't remember who it was, but said something like, you know, I was trying to insult some guy by calling him a Zionist, and he said, I'm a proud Zionist. And I didn't realize you could be a proud Zionist. So, you know, Palestinians use that term almost as derogatory or pejorative, and yet almost all Israelis in some sense would define themselves as Zionists, but their definitions just completely run the gamut. But it is a question in a sense of, you know, what is Zionism? Who's an Israeli? You know, you have 1 million Arabs there. You have a lot of people from the former Soviet Union that are only nominally Jewish. Maybe one grandmother was Jewish. Don't really feel close to the religion. It's a nation of immigrants, and so how do you bond them? What do you bond them or bind them around? And Zionism is a notion, and a pretty elastic one as well.
Yes, sir.
You know, in the past, the American Jewish voices were almost silent. You never heard of any of them criticizing Israel and its atrocities against the Palestinians. We noticed, and I'm sure you witnessed it too, in the past few years, a lot of these voices are coming in the open and criticizing Israel. A lot of books, a lot of speakers going around and talking about it, you know, against the Israeli lobby's wishes. And I don't know what do you think of them? Is it because they worrying about Israel, or because they really want to, you know, peace and justice for the Palestinians?
I think there's some interesting things that are beginning to change. I'll point to something that just happened very recently. AIPAC, the most prominent, famous Jewish lobby, was pushing very, very hard for additional sanctions against Iran. And so were a lot of senators and some in the House as well, particularly on the conservative side. And the Obama administration didn't want them, thought it was a bad idea that could undermine the negotiations right now. And basically that won the day. The senators pushing this backed off and said, okay, we're not going to do it. AIPAC, which had been very, very assertive about sanctions, more sanctions against Iran, has said, okay, we've decided now is not the appropriate time. So it was a pretty major defeat for them. And it showed the willingness of the Congress and the White House to go very much against the policy that AIPAC was proposing. I think in Washington you see the J Street, which is another Israeli lobby, but more from the center to the liberal side, which is its voice is becoming louder there, so you're getting a bit more of a debate. So I think traditionally and historically you're absolutely correct. I think you're seeing some movement. I don't think we're going to see any huge, dramatic, instantaneous change. But I think you are seeing a little bit of a broader debate, and it's something that always struck you in Israel. These are the kind of debates that every family has around the dinner table, that's on the talk shows, that's on TV, that's in the papers. And then you come to this country and it's, we support Israel, whatever their policy is. You say, well, you know, who? You go to the Israeli parliament, Knesset, and there's 10 different parties with 10 different policies. So I just think we should be having the kind of debate in the U.S. that you have in Israel in terms of what is a good policy for Israel, what is a good U.S. policy towards Israel, what is a good Israeli policy for themselves.
Sam?
Thank you for coming to Fort Wayne, and I really enjoyed your speech tonight. I'm wondering why it is that I can read more critical analysis of the Israeli government's behavior in Haaretz than I can in any American paper.
That's a good question. Again, I mean, just that's to the point of the previous question. This very vigorous debate that takes place in Israel. Now, it depends how you interpret that. I mean, I work at NPR now. I worked in the New York Times when I was in Israel, but I work at NPR now, and the pro-Israeli critics call us National Palestinian Radio. They think we're totally pro-Palestinian and never have a nice word to say about Israel. So not everyone would agree with that perspective, and obviously the pro-Israeli groups I was at an event like this when I was at the Times in Israel, and somebody stood up and said, everything you guys write in the Times about Israel is total nonsense. And I said, well, give me a specific. Well, I haven't read your paper in 10 years. And I said, well, he goes, but I'm sure if you had written something better, somebody would have told me about it. So, look, I think there are fewer American journalists there now, so we're getting less coverage, actually, than we used to. I don't have a very, I can't give you, there's so many people that think the American media is too critical of Israel, and others think it's not critical enough of the Palestinians.
Really? I'm sorry.
All I can tell you is I do basically every American journalist that was there during that period, and a lot before and since. The journalists make a very sincere effort, the kind of thing you talk about every single day of trying to, how do we be fair, how do we be accurate, knowing you're not going to please everybody. And we take criticism, I certainly did, took criticism seriously about should we be writing more about this issue, should we be writing less about that issue. I think it's a good ongoing discussion to have, but I think you certainly need to focus on specific stories and issues.
But if maybe Sam, let me just, and then follow up, Sam. Maybe he's not talking about specific journalists, maybe he's talking about editorial policies. Did you ever find that?
Of the publication?
Yeah.
Speaking as somebody who worked at the Times, they were great. They never questioned the stories we chose to write about, or how we chose to write about them. They would, ask us, okay, are we being fair to everybody here? Is this absolutely accurate? I never had any contact with the people on the editorial page, so they wrote on the editorial page what they wanted to write, and we reported on the news page what we wanted to report on.
The reason I ask, and it's my understanding at the Times that they actually hire a lot of American Jewish people that have children in the IDF, or I don't consider the Times to be necessarily a fair and balanced paper on this issue, but the issue in general will be resolved, I think, here in America, not in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. We provide Israel with so much diplomatic cover, we provide them with military aid, we provide them with economic aid, and we veto attempts to resolve the conflict in the Security Council. So the issue really, really could be resolved here, I think. And I don't think Americans have a good and accurate picture of what happened here, because there's consequences to pay for reporters that accurately report what happens there, isn't there?
No, I would have to disagree with you on that. It is a really free place to report as a journalist. People are very open. You can write critically of the Israelis. They get worse, as you say, they get as much or worse in their own press. And I would dispute the notion that the U.S. can decide things. Again, in 20 years of experience overseas, I think the U.S. consistently overestimates how much they can shape the conflict. I mean, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq. The U.S. has spent in both those places, years, sent hundreds of thousands of troops there, spent $1 trillion in both places, and look what we're leaving behind in Afghanistan. Even if you send the U.S. military there with all its full might for a decade, it's hard to change a place or to get the outcome you want. I don't know that withholding $3 billion from Israel is going to completely change the dynamic and the outcome of those events. The U.S. is influential, no doubt about it. But I think my experience has been that the U.S. overestimates how much we can shape events in places.
We have time for one more question. Al?
Can you comment with what little you know about Fort Wayne, about the coverage, the educational coverage here in Fort Wayne?
I really can't answer that in terms of the coverage of the media here. What I do know, we spoke earlier, is I think as I deal with on a daily basis, the traditional media is not the only way to go. I'm trying to talk to reporters every day about how to use Twitter, how to use Facebook, how to use social media, ways to get your message out, not just through the traditional method. You know, I deal with a lot of our foreign correspondents who've been radio correspondents for decades, and they just don't want to hear it when I talk about Twitter or Facebook, and I say, this is important, these are other ways to get your message out. So without knowing the specifics of that, I just think if you're not getting the kind of coverage you might want in the traditional media, start looking to social media and other forms of media. I think there are ways to get the message out.
Let's say thank you to Greg for being here. Greg will hang around up here in front if any of you'd like to come up and have a personal word with him. Folks, thanks for coming out tonight. Don't forget our next couple events. Take a flyer and a booklet home with you. Thanks a lot. Be safe on your way home.